future. So there is a current debate about how we confront climate change. And it's very interesting to hear of the plans of the Egypt government to make a big solar farm, for example, the biggest solar farm so far built, which is an obvious source of alternative energy to prevent the kind of smog and combustion and climate change that is being affected by big cities like Cairo and London. London's famous for its smog, and so on. So here is the picture of the British countryside if those two ice caps melt completely. And you'll see the area where I live here will be underwater. The whole of Lincolnshire will be, where my son lives here, will be underwater. My son's house and my house will be underwater in 200 years' time if both these ice sheets melt. So certain sections of British literature will no longer be there, even there. Never mind changed, they will be underwater parts of the British countryside where Thomas Hardy's novels are set, and so on. This is why we're doing eco-criticism. This is why we're asking questions about climate change. I just wanted to show you one eco-poet, my former colleague, Harriet Tarlow, writes this poem. I know you won't be able to read it, but I just wanted to show you that she's doing something experimental with poetry on the page. She calls this radical landscape poetry. This poetry is about walking behind her house from a hill called the Nab, and it's in the moment poetry about engaging with nature on a walk. But she is using an open form of poetry, which she argues in her introduction to this anthology where this appears, which is called The Ground Aslant. In the introduction to The Ground Aslant, she says radical landscape poetry is what we need. We need a radical landscape poetry to engage with our radical environmental crisis. And so she uses this radical form, and as do the other poets in her anthology, The Ground Aslant. And you see she's using the space on the page to create a radical, experimental kind of poetry to engage with the environmental crisis at the moment. So there's the reference if you want to look up this anthology, 2011, and read Harriet's introduction to radical landscape poetry. It's linguistically experimental in that it doesn't have conventional grammar. And it's also visually experimental in that it's open form, following the American poet Charles Olson, who was one of the Black Mountain poets who invented what he calls open form poetry that uses all the space on the page, and indeed lines sometimes, as you saw there. It's an indirect address to the Anthropocene. It appears to be just about her walking from her house up a hill. But in fact, of course, she's expecting that the reader now is aware that we're in the Anthropocene. And so everything that she writes about has a reverberation to our environmental crisis. You'll not be familiar perhaps with the term Anthropocene. Huh? No. Okay. The Anthropocene is the geological era in which we are now living. And it's a new geological era in which there will be laid down in the geological record the evidence of human species, of the human species. So it's about the human species altering the whole of our environment to such an extent that it's actually becoming a new geological layer. And that layer is carbon. and maybe some toxics, the toxic waste from nuclear power, which will be laid down. And there's some argument about when the Anthropocene started. Some argue that it started when human beings burned woodland to create space for agriculture. Others argue that it began with the internal combustion engine and the beginning of the creation of soot and the Industrial Revolution. Others argue that the Anthropocene is distinctive in laying down a layer of toxic waste which has come since nuclear power has been invented. And of course, we don't know how to dispose of successfully and sustainably the waste from nuclear power stations. So nuclear waste, in England, nuclear waste is stored in open tanks at the nuclear power stations, because nobody can decide a sustainably safe way of disposing of it for future generations. So here is something waiting to be laid down in the geological layer of the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene has come to be used by eco-critics to represent the environmental crisis created by human beings. That's the point. Because again, eco-criticism is concerned with examining how human beings need to alter their attitude towards nature, the environment in which we have our home and which we have so polluted as to have altered the atmosphere above our heads and the very weather systems in which we live and breathe. It's also challenging conventional constructions of nature, Harriet's radical landscape poetry. It's located in the moment of experience, so it's kind of phenomenological. It's very existential. It's in the moment. It doesn't have abstractions. It doesn't reflect on it. It doesn't explicitly philosophize. It is about being in the moment in nature, this poetry. But behind the back of it is an awareness of the Anthropocene. So it's about materiality, it's about engaging with nature, and it's about biosemiology, which is very simply reading the signs of nature, the signs that nature shows us, and the way in which nature is reading and responding to our signs, our presences at the same time. That's called biosemiology. And it's a new development out of eco-criticism. The English practitioner, if you're interested in following it up, is Wendy Wheeler, who has written 2 books introducing biosemiology. And this poetry is about practice as theory. It's not about theory as practice. It's about practice being conducted, the poems being written, and Harriet calling that poetry radical landscape poetry after she's already been doing it. Okay. The English poet who was killed in the First World War, Edward Thomas, asked this question. And as for seeing things as they really are, what is a fine summer's day, as in itself it really is? So here's a lovely eco-critical question. What is a fine summer's day in this text? What is a fine summer's day in our culture? Is the meteorological office to decide? Well, certainly the weatherman on TV in England will say it's going to be a fine summer's day, the sun's going to be shining all day long, and there's no chance of rain. On the island that I've just been to yesterday, between the 2 dams up the Nile, the British Dam and Nasser's Dam, on the island there, the Nubian people would say a fine summer's day is when it's raining all day, the opposite of England. So the meteorological office for the Nubian people would actually be quite different, the opposite of the English people. So nature is being constructed, a fine summer's day is being constructed in opposite terms in Nubia from Great Britain. Completely opposite terms. Or the poet. Is the poet to decide what is a fine summer's day? Or is the farmer to decide what is a fine summer's day? In the east of England, which has least rainfall, a fine summer's day would indeed be a wet day because they need rain for the harvest of the wheat crop in East Anglia, on the eastern side of England. But farmers elsewhere might regard a fine summer's day as a very sunny day. So what I'm pointing out is the social construction of nature. We construct nature in our literature. We construct it socially through our shared understanding of meanings. What by and large in British literature is a fine summer's day is shared by everyone. And by and large in British literature, that will be a sunshiny day without any rain. The opposite of a fine summer's day in Nubia. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that all physical nature is socially constructed. Some people will say, some eco-critics will argue that all nature is socially constructed, as though it doesn't exist. It's only socially constructed by language. But I'm not arguing that. When it rains, we get wet. We feel the wet. And if in England we stay out in the wet, we die of hypothermia. Because as a species, we have lost our protective covering of hair, some of us having lost it more than others. So we die if we don't construct nature dangerously when it's raining in England. Nature exists independent of our presence, I'm arguing, but when we begin to talk about nature, it's constructed by our language, which is embedded with valuations, good, bad, rain bad, sun good, in British literature, and attitudes. So language constructs nature for us. Nature exists outside language, of course, but as soon as we start to talk about it, write about it, read about it, our language shares valuations and attitudes. And that's what eco-criticism is. It's really unpacking what are the valuations and attitudes embedded in the language in this text that we're reading. Thus, by direct experience of nature, it is mediated by language that inevitably constructs cultural associations. Cultural associations will vary geographically. I've just shown you that it's different in Eastern England and Western England, it's different in Namibia, it's different in Nubia and in Britain, and it's different in periods of time. It's different sometimes it's different at historical moments. But it is shared culturally. Of course, within these culturally shared valuations, rain bad, sun good, there are individual constructions. I mean, some individuals will say, I like going out in the rain. And that's fine. So there are individuals who are exceptional within the shared, it doesn't undermine the shared cultural assumption which writers can use and play with, assuming a shared cultural assumption, but individual readers will have individual constructions of nature based on their own past experience. I remember my grandma taking me out to play with the puddles when there'd been a heavy rain, and I therefore love walking through puddles. And when I open the curtains in the morning, I therefore, unlike the rest of society in England, I therefore say, oh, what a lovely day, there are going to be puddles, and I can have my individual construction of rain that is the opposite of the rest of society, which writers will be able to play with. So, here is a poem by Edward Thomas, and it's called Bob's Lane. Women he liked, did shovel-bearded Bob, old Farmer Hayward of the Heath, but he loved horses. Women he liked, but he loved horses. He himself was like a cob, a kind of horse, and leather-coloured. Also, he loved a tree, for the life in them. He loved most living things, but a tree chiefly. All along the lane he planted elms, where now the stormcock sings. A bird sings in these elms that he's planted. Travellers hear from the slow climbing train. Till then, this track had never had a name. For all its thicket and nightingales that should have earned it, it should have been called Nightingale Lane, because you can hear the nightingales there, but it never had a name. No one was to blame. To name a thing beloved, man sometimes fails. Many years since, Bob Hayward died, and now none passes there. None passes there. This lane is no longer used because the mist and the rain out of the elms have turned the lane to slough, to mud and gloom. The name alone survives, Bob's Lane. So Bob thought he was doing a great thing, planting trees, because he loved trees. The result of planting the trees was that they overshadowed the lane, turned it to mud and wet and slough, and nobody could use it anymore. Is Bob's Lane a good place or a bad place?
It used to be.
It's a beautiful place. It's got trees in it. But it's a lane that no one can use anymore. So an anthropocentric reading of this poem, anthropocentrism, human-centered reading of this poem, would say it's negative. No humans use the lane, it's full of mud. There is a utilitarian approach because it can't be used. There's a utilitarian valuation of the lane in this poem. It's materialistic because it's about the materials, the trees and the mud, and that's the focus of the poem. It's called Bob's Lane, and it's remembered as Bob's Lane because Bob made a mistake. Out of good intentions, but he made a mistake. And of course this is nature poetry, it's about trees. And maybe it's in a tradition of pastoral literature, maybe it's idealising trees and love of trees, perhaps. So we'll come to that in the second lecture this afternoon. If we take an ecocentric reading, if we decenter the human focus and focus on nature and take an ecocentric reading of the poem, there are elms where there were none before. Okay? So that's a good thing. And in those elms there are birds singing. And it's not about utilitarianism, it's about love. It's about love of trees. It celebrates love of trees, this poem. And it's not about materialism, it's about idealism. Idealism, planting a row of trees because you love trees. And Bob's Lane is Bob's a heroic figure. It's a positive name, not a negative name. The name's the same, but now it has a positive ring if you read it egocentrically. And of course it's not nature poetry describing nature, celebrating nature. It's eco-poetry, which is slightly different. And of course I would argue it's post-pastoral literature because it's asking questions about idealisation. Has Bob idealised trees to such an extent that he's made a mistake? And that is a post-pastoral question that this poem is asking the reader. And you notice that I'm saying that the poet is asking questions of the reader. And that's an eco-critical approach. What questions are thrown up for the reader by this text, by this writer? Not what does this writer say in this text, what does this text mean? No, what questions has the writer risen for the reader to consider in this poem? And because it's such an open-ended poem, I would say it's an ideal text for an eco-critical approach, for discussing the tension between these two ways of reading the text. Okay? So eco-criticism is asking, what are the constructions of nature in this poem, and what questions is the writer raising for the reader in this poem?